Erin Patterson says she's innocent, but the evidence tells a chillingly different story. As the jury deliberates, the fate of the woman accused of serving a deadly lunch hangs by a thread. Will she walk free, or will the truth about the poisoned meal finally come to light? Meanwhile, the families of the victims are left shattered, grappling with unbearable loss and unanswered questions. In this episode, we dive deep into the tragic fallout of that fateful day, uncovering the ripple effects of grief, suspicion, and the relentless fight for justice unfolding inside the courtroom. Korumburra, population 5,000, isn't the kind of place that makes international headlines. Tucked into the hills of South Gippsland, it's a quiet, rural town in Victoria where cows outnumber people and life revolves around small comforts. There's the weekly farmers market where neighbors swap homemade jams and gardening tips. There's the local pub where the same handful of regulars line up at the bar like clockwork. There's the church on Bridge Street whose bells echo through the town every Sunday morning, signaling not just worship, but community. Here, life is predictable, peaceful, safe. But on July 29, 2023, that peace was shattered. Doan and Gail Patterson weren't just names in a tragedy. They were the heart of the community. Married for decades, they were known as kind, generous, always willing to lend a hand or offer a warm word. Gail's sister, Heather Wilkinson, and her husband, Ian, the local pastor, were no different. The four of them had built lives rooted in faith and family. They were the kind of people others looked up to, the kind who would show up with a casserole if someone lost a loved one, or volunteer to help fix a neighbor's fence. When all four of them fell violently ill. After attending a lunch hosted by Erin Patterson, the town stood still. In a place where rumors don't travel fast, they explode. Speculation filled the air. People whispered in grocery stores, exchanged theories over fences. No one wanted to believe it was deliberate, but no one could ignore the facts. The inti de hisneb symptoms weren't mild, they were terrifying. And the outcome, 3 deaths and 1 near fatality, was devastating. The town was grieving, but it was also confused. How could something so horrific happen so quietly right under their noses? The woman at the center of it, Erin, wasn't a stranger. She was known here. Erin and Simon Patterson had once seemed like any other couple in town. They had 2 children, attended church, shopped at Woolworths, and lived in a modest home just outside the town center. Even after their separation, Erin had remained a familiar face, but behind the politeness and community ties, there were cracks. Erin and Simon's relationship had grown cold. Disputes over money, mounting resentment, and emotional distance painted a very different picture behind closed doors. Though the two had separated, Erin remained close to Simon's family, or so it seemed. She still communicated with Doan and Gail. She still showed up at family gatherings. And when she invited them to lunch in late July, there was no reason to question her intentions. Not at first stop, but in hindsight, the invitation took on a darker tone. Especially given what followed. For the townspeople of Korumburra, the reality was hard to process. These weren't just names in a newspaper. These were people they knew, people they had prayed with, laughed with, grown up around. And now they were gone, not because of an accident on the road or an illness that came too soon, but because someone, possibly someone they trusted, had poisoned them. The idea was unthinkable. But denial couldn't hold up forever. As national media descended on the town, things shifted. Reporters lined the streets. Camera crews set up outside the courthouse. True crime podcasters and internet sleuths started arriving, turning the quiet lanes into a spectacle. Residents who once avoided gossip found themselves watching interviews and reading online forums, trying to make sense of it all. The name, Erin Patterson, wasn't just whispered in grocery aisles anymore. It was printed in headlines and trending on Twitter. The people of Korumburra were caught in the middle, mourning their friends while watching their town become the stage for one of Australia's most disturbing murder trials. Their grief was real, their confusion deeper than ever. Because the horror hadn't come from some distant criminal. It had come from within. From someone who had shared their streets, their schools, their lives, and that, perhaps, was the most haunting part of all. To understand this case, you have to understand Erin Patterson, or at least the version of her the public thought they knew. She wasn't loud, brash, or confrontational. In fact, most who encountered her described her as quiet, perhaps even reserved. A stay-at-home mother in her 40s, Erin appeared on the surface like any ordinary woman raising 2 children in rural Victoria. She volunteered at the local school. She smiled politely in public. She said all the right things. But beneath the surface, something was unraveling, something darker, colder, more calculated than anyone imagined. Erin had once been married to Simon Patterson, the son of Doan and Gail Patterson, and nephew to Heather Wilkinson. Their marriage had once seemed stable. They had built a home together in Korumburra, and while they weren't especially social, they were known as a typical suburban family. But behind the closed doors of their modest home, the cracks had started to show. Arguments flared. Tensions rose. By 2020, their relationship had become strained, and by late 2022, they were living separately. Erin moved to Leongatha, a neighboring town. Simon stayed behind. The split wasn't marked by violence or scandal, but rather a slow erosion of trust, mostly revolving around money, property, and simmering bitterness. Despite the separation, Erin kept close ties with Simon's family, a fact that would seem odd in hindsight. She visited Doan and Gail regularly. She continued to attend church services at the same place Simon's parents and the Wilkinsons worshipped. She even brought her children to Sunday sermons led by Pastor Ian Wilkinson, who she'd known for years. To many, this closeness looked admirable, a commitment to family despite personal hardship. But to investigators, it would later raise troubling questions, because while she smiled in public, Erin was venting in private. Text messages later recovered by authorities revealed a storm of resentment brewing beneath her calm exterior. In one thread, she referred to Simon's family, using crude language. She called them controlling, manipulative. In others, she expressed frustration over custody arrangements, financial stress, and how she felt abandoned by those she once considered allies. The Erin Patterson behind closed doors was very different from the Erin Patterson seen in church pews or at the school gate. She was angry, isolated, and some would argue quietly plotting revenge. Perhaps the most chilling part of Erin's story is how ordinary she appeared while planning something so unthinkable. She didn't lash out violently. She didn't scream or threaten or wave weapons. She cooked. She hosted. She set a table. And if the prosecution's case is to be believed, she did so while hiding a deadly secret ingredient inside one of the most innocent acts imaginable, feeding your family to the outside world. Erin was still the ex-wife, the mother, the neighbor. But to the families of those who would not survive that lunch, she would become something else entirely. The woman who killed with kindness, who poisoned with a plate, and who lied with a smile. The date was July 29, 2023, a quiet Saturday in Leongatha, the kind of town where nothing much happens on weekends beyond foodie games, slow coffee mornings, and the occasional family lunch. For Erin Patterson, that day would mark something much more calculated. That morning, she rose early, claiming to be exhausted but determined. She had planned something special, or so she said in the messages she sent to her estranged husband. Simon, she had prepared an elaborate dish, individual beef Wellingtons made from high-quality beef fillet, served with creamy mashed potatoes and sautéed greens. It wasn't a casual meal. It was an effort, a statement, a performance. One that, according to her, cost a small fortune and possibly 3 lives. Simon had been invited to attend the lunch, along with his parents Doan and Gail, his Aunt Heather Wilkinson, and her husband Ian. The pretext for the gathering? Erin told them she needed to discuss a serious medical issue, something deeply personal. She hinted at a potential cancer diagnosis, and despite the estrangement, she painted the invitation as a vulnerable emotional plea, but Simon declined. The night before, he texted Erin saying he felt uncomfortable attending. Something about it didn't sit right. That decision, in hindsight, may have saved his life. The others, however, agreed to come. Erin's 2 children were sent to the cinema that afternoon, a decision that investigators would later find disturbingly convenient. At the lunch, the guests sat around the table, people who had known each other for decades. They had shared holidays, birthdays, weddings. Now they were breaking bread over what seemed like a normal, if slightly tense, family meal. But not everything about that meal was normal. According to police reports, Erin served her 4 guests their beef Wellingtons on large gray plates. Her own plate, oddly, was different, smaller, lighter in color. Why? No one knows. It was a subtle detail, but one that would later feed theories of premeditation. At some point during the meal, Erin made her announcement. She told the group she was facing a serious illness and had possibly been diagnosed with cancer. The room turned quiet. The group, all of them devout Christians, reportedly prayed with her. They believed her. They supported her. They trusted her, but Erin Patterson didn't have cancer. She never had. The entire story had been fabricated in the meal. It wasn't just food. It was, according to prosecutors, bait. Hours later, all 4 guests began experiencing violent gastrointestinal symptoms: nausea, sweating, vomiting, crippling pain. They didn't assume they'd been poisoned, not at first. It must be food poisoning, they thought, some bad meat or off mushrooms, but the symptoms grew worse by the hour. Within 24 hours, they were in the hospital. Within days, 3 were dead: Doan, Gail, and Heather. Pastor Ian Wilkinson barely survived after spending weeks in intensive care, clinging to life with the help of a liver transplant. Erin, meanwhile, stayed quiet. She told doctors she'd eaten the meal too, though oddly, her symptoms were minimal. She claimed to have gotten sick but left the hospital against medical advice. Her children, she said, had eaten the leftovers, but she refused to bring them in for testing. That refusal alone raised eyebrows. And soon, what looked like a tragic family accident began to morph into something far more sinister. This was no case of spoiled food. The medical examiners discovered a deadly toxin in the victim's systems, one consistent with Amanita phalloides, better known as the death cat mushroom, a fungus so toxic that even a few bites can kill. And now the question hanging in the air was impossible to ignore. Did Erin Patterson deliberately poison her own family? By nightfall on July 29th, something was clearly wrong. The lunch guests had returned to their homes, but the symptoms came on fast, and they came on hard. First came the nausea, the vomiting, the intense abdominal pain. Then came diarrhea, fever, and confusion. Within hours, all 4 of Erin's guests were violently ill, deteriorating quickly, their bodies reacting as if something inside them had turned against them. They weren't just sick, they were poisoned. Emergency services were called, and one by one the victims were rushed to the hospital. Medical staff scrambled to make sense of what they were seeing. Food poisoning? A bacterial infection? Nothing. Added up, the symptoms were too aggressive, too fast-moving. It wasn't until toxicologists were called in that the horrifying truth began to emerge. The patients were showing classic signs of amatoxin poisoning, a rare and lethal toxin found in death cat mushrooms. Within hours of ingestion, the toxins begin to destroy the liver and kidneys from the inside out, often beyond repair. For Doan and Gail Patterson, their conditions worsened rapidly. Gail passed away first. Doan followed shortly after. Heather Wilkinson, Gail's sister, succumbed days later. All 3 had been healthy, vibrant people just days before. Now they were gone. Pastor Ian Wilkinson, the only survivor, barely clung to life. He was placed in intensive care and underwent a liver transplant. He was in a coma, slipping in and out of consciousness, unaware that he had become the sole surviving witness to a meal that had claimed the lives of nearly everyone else at the table. Meanwhile, Erin Patterson was strangely detached. Though she presented herself at the hospital claiming she too had symptoms, her behavior didn't align with someone in genuine distress. She refused to be admitted for testing. She told medical staff she'd left the beef Wellington leftovers for her children, yet when asked to bring them in for examination, she hesitated. Doctors urged her repeatedly. They were trying to understand what had caused the poisonings, and feared her children could be in danger. But Erin delayed, evaded, and eventually left the hospital. At first, investigators didn't want to believe this was intentional. Mass poisonings are rare, extremely rare. But from the very beginning, Erin's story raised red flags. Her symptoms didn't match the others. Her timeline didn't add up. She claimed she used store-bought mushrooms, but her details were vague. And when asked to assist in locating the source, her cooperation was inconsistent at best, suspicious. At worst, the grief in the town was raw and overwhelming. 3 people had died within days of each other, all respected, cherished members of the same close-knit community. The funeral announcement sent shockwaves through Korumburra and beyond. People wept openly at the church. Simon Patterson, Erin's estranged husband, stood before hundreds at the memorial and delivered a eulogy that stunned even those closest to him. His mother's last text to the family group chat was read aloud, "Lots of love to you all." Those would be her final words, and yet one person was noticeably absent from the services, Erin Patterson. As mourners gathered to say goodbye, Erin was nowhere to be seen. A reporter confronted her outside her home, asking why she hadn't attended. Her reply was cold, detached. "My lawyer told me not to speak." The silence spoke louder than words. Truth was emerging, and it was darker than anyone had imagined. Erin Patterson hadn't just served a meal. She had delivered a weapon. And the ripple effect of that act, whether through malice or manipulation, had now become a tidal wave of grief, suspicion, and national outrage. At first, there were only questions. How could a single meal lead to so much devastation? Where did the mushrooms come from? And most urgently, was this truly an accident or something far more sinister? For the detectives assigned to the case, the pieces didn't fit together. From the moment the poisonings were reported, Victoria police knew this wasn't a typical foodborne illness. It was a mass poisoning with a lethal agent known to be one of the most dangerous on Earth. The victims hadn't just gotten sick, they had been exposed to amatoxin, the primary toxin in the death cap mushroom, responsible for over 90% of mushroom-related deaths worldwide. As the media firestorm grew, the police began quietly building a case. The first step was retracing Erin Patterson's food purchases. She had told authorities she bought her ingredients from two places: fresh mushrooms from a local Woolworths, and dried mushrooms from an Asian grocery store in Melbourne's southeast. But this trail went cold almost immediately. None of the stores reported stocking death cap mushrooms. Health officials swept through the shops Erin mentioned, testing every batch of produce, but found no trace of anything dangerous. Then came the discovery that raised eyebrows. Erin had discarded a food dehydrator shortly after the lunch, a kitchen appliance used to dry out food, including mushrooms. It was dumped at a local waste site not long after the meal. Police recovered it, now considered a key piece of potential evidence. Erin claimed she threw it away because it reminded her of an emotional comment made by her ex-husband at the hospital. "Is that what used to kill them?" That single sentence, whether meant seriously or not, seemed to trigger a panicked response. But to detectives, it was much more than emotional. It suggested guilt and worse, intent. Then came the digital trail. Erin's devices painted a murky picture. Her computers had been used to visit a citizen science website that tracked the location of various wild mushrooms in Victoria, including known death cap sightings. A post had gone live just one day before the deadly lunch, listing a sighting of the poisonous fungi near Erin's hometown. That area was a known growth zone for toxic mushrooms, and cell tower data placed Erin in the vicinity just days earlier. The time frame? Roughly 25 minutes. Long enough, investigators concluded, to pick a basket full of deadly mushrooms and leave, but that wasn't the only evidence that emerged. Her mobile activity was even more concerning. Erin had multiple phones and had allegedly been swapping SIM cards between devices, a tactic often used to avoid traceability. One of the phones had been factory reset not once, but multiple times, including after it had already been seized by police. Her main mobile phone had completely vanished and was never recovered, despite extensive searches of her property. To police, this wasn't just strange, it was strategic. And to the public, it seemed more and more like Erin wasn't just unlucky. She was hiding something. The town that had once treated her with quiet sympathy now turned cold. As more people read the reports, the image of a misunderstood mother began to crumble. Erin wasn't cooperating. She wasn't transparent. She wasn't grieving. Her tears came during interviews, but they didn't seem real. Experts in behavioral analysis reviewed footage of her rare appearances, pointing out inconsistencies. No real tears, blocking gestures, evasive eye movements. In one clip, she wipes away what seemed to be imaginary tears, a gesture professional lie detectors refer to as masking. For criminologists, the pattern was disturbingly familiar. Poison, especially with a substance like death caps, is a weapon of stealth. It doesn't require confrontation. It allows the killer to distance themselves from the act while appearing innocent, and statistically, among female perpetrators of homicide, poisoning is disproportionately common. Erin's behavior, her lies, her timing, everything fit the profile. But there was still one hurdle left: motive. Why would she do it? What did she stand to gain? That question remained unanswered. But investigators knew one thing: the more they uncovered, the more it seemed that this lunch had not been a mistake, but a message. By this point, the name Erin Patterson had become national shorthand for scandal, suspicion, and something far darker. Her photo was splashed across headlines, her quiet home staked out by news vans and online sleuths. Yet amid the growing media storm, Erin herself remained mostly silent. She didn't plead for the public's understanding. She didn't make heartfelt statements to clear her name. Instead, she hid behind a veil of legal silence, shielded by her lawyer's advice and her own evasiveness. That silence, far from helping, only deepened the world's fascination with her and made her seem more guilty with each passing day. But then, unexpectedly, Erin agreed to speak. Just once. A brief, awkward, heavily scrutinized television interview outside her home in Leongatha, Australia's most infamous murder suspect, standing under an overcast sky, staring into a reporter's microphone as the world leaned in. What she said wasn't much. But what she didn't say spoke volumes. The reporter began gently. Can you tell us what happened that Saturday? Erin's answer was vague, emotionally flat. It's a tragedy. I'm devastated by what's happened. She mentioned the victims by name: Dawn, Gail, Heather, and Ian, and described them as some of the best people I've ever met. She even referred to Gail as the mother I never had, citing the loss of her own mother years earlier. But as the words poured out, something felt wrong. There were no real tears. Her voice cracked, but her eyes stayed dry. Then came the strange behavior, wiping at her face where no tears had fallen, fluttering her hands nervously, blocking her eyes as if she couldn't bear to see the truth herself. Body language experts would later analyze every second of that interview. Steve Van Aperen, a world-renowned specialist in deception detection, was among them. His verdict was chilling. He pointed to masking behavior, prolonged eye closure, and a dramatic increase in blink rate, all telltale signs of someone engaging in deception. There's a lot of wailing in her words, he noted, but no visible tears. Her gestures, he explained, weren't aligned with genuine grief. They were aligned with guilt, or at the very least, with someone who had rehearsed sorrow, not felt it. Then came the questions Erin didn't answer. Did you cook the same meal? Did you eat it? Where did the mushrooms come from? Her response: silence, deflection, refusal. My lawyer told me not to talk. And when pressed again, did you kill them, Erin? She didn't deny it outright. She simply said, I didn't do anything, I loved them. To investigators, that sentence rang hollow. You don't kill the people you love with one of the most lethal poisons known to man. And if you're wrongly accused, you don't hide behind vague platitudes, you fight. You scream. You beg people to believe you. But Erin? Erin stared straight ahead and said nothing. Even more disturbing was what police found later. In the days surrounding the interview, Erin had been tampering with evidence. She factory reset one of her phones multiple times. Another had vanished entirely. Search warrants revealed she'd used multiple SIM cards, possibly to avoid detection. Her computer history showed research into mushroom toxicity. And her food dehydrator, now a central piece of the puzzle, had been dumped and recovered. An act of calculated concealment, not carelessness. Public opinion began to harden. The court of public judgment may not issue legal verdicts, but its voice was loud, and it had already spoken. Erin was no longer seen as a grieving ex-wife. She was the mushroom killer. The woman who had carefully lured 4 people to her table, watched them eat, and walked away clean. Still, no charges had been laid. Not yet. The investigation was ongoing. But public patience was wearing thin. Everyone, police, prosecutors, even the townspeople of Korumburra, was waiting for the next move. Because if Erin Patterson thought one brief interview would silence the world, she had gravely underestimated just how loudly the truth can scream. The trial of Erin Patterson began like something out of a movie, but the horror was all too real. Held in the regional center of Morwell, just 45 minutes from Leongatha, the proceedings attracted more attention than any local case in living memory. It wasn't just the Australian press that showed up. True crime podcasters flew in from other states. International journalists reserved motel rooms weeks in advance. The courthouse, usually quiet and overlooked, suddenly became a magnet for cameras, speculation, and small-town curiosity. Even self-proclaimed internet sleuths began camping outside from as early as 5 a.m., hoping to secure a spot in the courtroom gallery, all just to catch a glimpse of the woman behind the most infamous meal in modern Australian history. Inside courtroom 4, the mood was heavy. The air seemed to hum with anticipation as Erin Patterson took her seat in the dock. Her appearance was subdued, neat hair, dark clothing, little expression. She avoided eye contact. But the moment that shocked everyone came just days into the proceedings. Erin announced that she would take the stand. It was a bold, unexpected move. Under Australian law, defendants are not required to testify in their own defense. Most, advised by their lawyers, choose not to, but Erin? She walked to the witness box and took the oath. When she spoke, her voice was soft, almost apologetic. Through tears, real or rehearsed, no one could be sure, she explained that the reason she had gathered the family that day was to reconnect, to feel close to them again. She admitted she told them she might have cancer, and admitted that was a lie. "I'm not proud of it," she said, "but I wanted their attention. I wanted them to care." Her words painted a picture of emotional instability, not criminal intent. But not everyone was convinced. The prosecution, armed with weeks of forensic evidence, began to dismantle her claims one by one. They presented Erin's internet history, her deleted texts, her lie about the Asian grocery store. They revealed her connection to the online database that tracked death cat mushroom sightings. They described the missing phone, the deleted files, the discarded dehydrator, each a breadcrumb and a trail of deception. Piece by piece, they laid out a chilling portrait. A woman who had meticulously planned a meal not of love or reconciliation, but of death. The most damning testimony came from the sole survivor of the lunch, Pastor Ian Wilkinson. Still visibly frail, he walked into the courtroom and faced the woman who had nearly killed him. He described how Erin seemed oddly composed during the meal, how she claimed to be sick afterward yet showed no signs of discomfort, and how she had avoided contact in the days that followed, even as 3 of his closest loved ones lay dying. The defense pushed back, insisting there was no clear motive. They argued Erin was emotionally fragile, perhaps delusional, but not a killer. They pointed to her inconsistent behavior as a symptom of panic, not planning. They questioned whether the death cat mushrooms had been intentionally added or accidentally mixed with store-bought fungi, but the jury remained still, silent, watching, absorbing every word. As the days stretched into weeks, the courtroom became a pressure cooker of emotion. Family members wept, reporters typed furiously, and Erin? Erin changed. She grew combative. Her answers sharpened. Her frustrations surfaced. Under cross-examination, she snapped more than once. She denied serving the victims on different plates. She denied assigning specific seats. She denied wiping her phones with malicious intent. And when asked about the text she sent cursing Simon's family just weeks earlier, she said she had only been venting and that she could have just gone and screamed into a paddock instead. It was an odd defense, and it didn't land well. The prosecution ended their case with a simple but devastating argument. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't mental illness. This was murder, planned and served in 4 neat portions. The Hindushid stabbed Sinded. Jury now had to decide if Erin Patterson had indeed turned a family lunch into a calculated act of vengeance, and if they believed her version of the truth, or the mountain of evidence that said otherwise. While the courtroom wrestled with the evidence, outside its walls, an entire community was unraveling. The grief in Korumburra was like a shadow that hung over every church pew, every street corner, every whispered conversation. This wasn't just a high-profile crime story playing out in the media. This was home. And the people lost weren't faceless victims on a screen. They were mentors, neighbors, parents, friends. People who waved as they passed by. People who prayed beside you on Sunday morning. Dawn and Gil Patterson had been married for decades. The kind of couple that seemed to move through life in sync. Always together, always anchored in faith and family. They were known for their kindness, their warmth, their willingness to show up when someone needed help. Gail had the sort of soft presence that made people feel at ease. Dem was quiet, strong, thoughtful. Together, they were a team, and the tragedy of their deaths on consecutive days felt like a cruel echo of that lifelong bond. As one friend put it, it's fitting in a heartbreaking way. They did everything together, even this. Heather Wilkinson, Gail's sister, was equally beloved. She and her husband, Pastor Ian Wilkinson, were pillars of the local Baptist church. Heather was the organizer, always planning meals, coordinating volunteers, checking in on those who were sick or struggling. Ian, a man of deep conviction and gentle leadership, had led hundreds of sermons, baptized children, comforted the grieving. The fact that he had survived but barely was seen as both a miracle and a cruel twist. He had lived through the meal that killed the people closest to him. But he would wake up in a hospital bed to find his wife gone, his friends buried, his life unrecognizably changed. Erin Patterson, Erin's estranged husband, was perhaps the most complex figure in the emotional fallout. He was the son of Doan. And Gail, the nephew of Heather, and the man who had narrowly escaped death that day simply by trusting his gut. His text declining Erin's lunch invitation had likely saved his life, but it hadn't saved his heart. At their memorial service, Simon stood before the crowd and read the final message his mother had sent their family group chat from her hospital bed. "Lots of love to you all." That line, so simple, so tragically final, left mourners in tears because it wasn't just a goodbye. It was a reminder of what had been stolen: love, connection, trust, and the quiet joy of being together. But amid the grief, there was also confusion, anger, betrayal. Many in the community had known Erin. They had smiled at her in the supermarket, exchanged pleasantries at school pickup, listened to her speak at church. And now they were asking themselves the impossible question: had she really done this? Had she really sat down across from her loved ones, watched them eat, and known what would happen next? Some couldn't bear to believe it. Others couldn't believe it took so long for justice to catch up. The divide was painful. It split friendships, stirred gossip, filled local Facebook groups with speculation. Cornborough, once a town of quiet streets and shared values, was now the center of a storm it never asked for. Residents found themselves avoiding reporters. Others leaned into the chaos, turning their grief into rage, their mourning into a desire for answers. And still Erin remained silent. No apologies, no remorse. Just courtroom statements and a face that gave little away. For the families left behind, there was no closure. Only holes in their homes, in their Sunday routines, in the future that would now never come. People talked about forgiveness, but no one truly knew what that would look like, because forgiveness needs truth. And in the absence of truth, grief becomes heavier. It's CLCIFIES. In the end, the community was left not just to mourn their dead, but to mourn their sense of safety, their belief in the goodness of neighbors, the comfort of small-town life. That innocence was gone. And in its place stood a haunting realization. Sometimes the people you think you know best can serve you the most unforgivable betrayal. 9 weeks. That's how long it took for the courtroom to hear it all. The witness testimonies, the expert analyses, the text messages, the deleted files, the stories Erin Patterson told, and the stories she tried to hide. For the jury, 12 ordinary people suddenly placed at the heart of one of Australia's most haunting cases. The weight of their decision was immeasurable. They didn't just carry the burden of the law, they carried the weight of a town's grief, a nation's curiosity, and a family's shattered future. When the final day of trial arrived, the atmosphere inside the courthouse was electric. Outside, camera crews adjusted their lenses. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Erin Patterson sat motionless, her hands folded, her face blank. Around her, the families of the victims braced themselves, not just for the verdict, but for whatever came after Daw. And then the jury returned, guilty on 3 counts of murder for Doan Patterson, Gail Patterson, and Heather Wilkinson. Guilty on 1 count of attempted murder for Pastor Ian Wilkinson. The courtroom was silent at first. Then came the quiet sobs, a mixture of relief and sorrow, finality and pain. For the prosecution, it was a moment of validation. For the families, it was the beginning of a healing process that had felt impossible for so long. And for Erin, it was the end of her story in the public eye. But the beginning of something far darker behind prison walls. As the judge read the sentencing, Erin Patterson offered a final statement. I'm devastated. I love them. I can't believe this has happened. And I'm so sorry. But by then, few believed her words. They came too late, after too many lies. After too much death. Trial was over. The story had reached its legal conclusion. But the emotional questions remained, thick in the air, stubborn in the hearts of everyone who had followed the case. Why? Why did she do it? Why them? Why that way? Why go to such elaborate lengths, the foraging, the dehydration, the deception? To destroy people who had once welcomed her as family? No one could answer that with certainty, not the prosecutors. Not the psychologists, not even the jury. Only Erin knew the truth. And if she had a reason, a real one, she never shared. The motive was swallowed by silence, buried beneath legal statements and tears that may or may not have been real. For Simon Patterson, the man who lost both parents and an aunt in a single meal, the grief will never fully lift. His family is gone. His children will grow up with the shadow of their mother's crime looming over their lives. And Pastor Ann Wilkinson, the survivor who will live with the memory of that day forever, must find a way to forgive a tragedy that nearly took everything from him. Korumburra has tried to return to normal, but how do you rebuild when trust itself has been poisoned? The church door is still open. The local paper still prints, but something is different now. The innocence is gone. And in its place, a scar that will take years to fade, because this wasn't just a story of murder. It was a story of betrayal, of calculated cruelty masked as care, of trust weaponized and turned deadly. A woman cooked a meal, a family gathered. And by the time dessert should have been served, the clock on 3 lives had already begun ticking. Erin Patterson's name is now etched into Australia's criminal history. But the real legacy belongs to those who lost their lives, not because of anything they did wrong, but because they sat down for lunch with someone they trusted. And as the dust settles, one final question still lingers in the minds of everyone. Who followed the case? Was this evil or something even worse? A kind of coldness we can't explain, the kind that smiles across a table and serves death with a knife and fork.